Joining us from Washington, D.C., Dr. Mikongo Dibinga, Professor of Intercultural Communication at the American University. Hello, Dr. Dibinga. It's been a while. Great to have you back on the show. Another blast from the past, Joe Bob from Orange County, California, host of the Daily Caller Live, a Turning Point USA contributor. Hey there, and here in our Tel Aviv studios, the one and only Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us today. Our main topic tonight, affirmative on action. The Supreme Court deeming race cannot be a factor for colleges to diverse themselves. So is the American dream of being judged solely by merit merely a myth?
It's a question of the ideal world versus the real world. Of course, colorblindness and individualism are excellent principles, but reality requires a bit more nuance. Affirmative action is based on the idea that past achievement does not always reflect potential because certain, and true merit, because certain marginalized groups haven't had the chance, and therefore they need a leg up or a second look. How to do it and how much to do it is, of course, the big question. So as with most things in life, a balance is required.
Dr. Dibinga, has affirmative action failed?
People always attach affirmative action to unqualified Black students. And as Mr. Perry was saying just a moment ago, he talked about giving people a second look. In many situations, it's giving students a first look. People who normally would not, like a Clarence Thomas, who normally, because of where they were attending school or the community that they were in, were not going to be able to make it through the application process at Harvard because they didn't have the resources and the knowledge base.
Why race has anything to do with those particulars is beyond me. There are rich Black people in this country. There are poor Black people. There are rich Asians. There are poor Asians. There are rich white people. There are poor white people. So to say that the color of your skin is solely determinative of how you can achieve in this culture is not accurate.
Look, I can help you out here because there's a reason why people think that. There is an enormous income gap in the U.S. and an even greater and completely inadmissible wealth gap. And it's understandable if you're talking about immigrants who came from poor and underdeveloped countries. But 10 generations down the road, if this is persistently the case, and if it diminishes not with great speed, then clearly there has been a failure. Ellie, it's not affirmative action that's failed. It's American society that has failed. And clearly there is an education failure. Clearly there is not enough being done in terms of frameworks and incentives. And therefore, a corrective action is needed. This is a matter of semantics,
really. But can you fix an injustice with an injustice? That's the basic question.
Well, the idea is that it isn't necessarily an injustice, because if you are making a special effort to identify the future potential of people who have not had the chance to show past achievement because they come from inner city schools which do not provide the same education as fine private schools, then obviously you're just attempting in some way to level the playing field. I do admit that it can feel terrible to people who were once dominant and now are the beheaded aristocrat. But there is an argument that the societal good is to increase the amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, and that's John Stuart Mill. It's not me speaking.
One is you're assuming that the affirmative action has worked in terms of the average income of varying minorities. Anybody who's received affirmative action doesn't seem to actually have helped, because a lot of times they're comparing it to the white counterparts and not the top. Well, guess what? The top has changed, and Asian Americans and Indian Americans are at the top of the earning standards. So it doesn't really make sense that you would work on that sense.
Many Black people and other groups who have benefited from that, they may not be at the top of the income scale, but they are definitely better off than where they would be without these policies.
And by the way, Joe Bob, there are various studies that show how affirmative action has had results. One of them is the graduation gap that shows that, for example, states in areas and in schools that have affirmative action, it has fallen from 10% to 5 to 6%. I'm not sure why that would be funny. And also, by the way, the income and wealth inequalities, which I bemoaned earlier on, are diminishing. Just not fast enough. You could argue that affirmative action has had something to do with that by creating more polished people from minority backgrounds that are ready for the workplace, and obviously that attaches to income. Realistically, there is not a problem in America of overall of white people having no access to wealth. White people control I think $124 trillion worth of wealth in the U.S. compared to less than $10 trillion for black people, and that's about 4 to 1 on a per capita basis. Yeah. It's just not the problem. The problem is angry, seething masses of minority people who have reason to be unhappy. And I fail to see why we would celebrate the removal of one of the methods that we have tried to ease the problem.
Their skin, there's a right to celebrate that. Maybe this makes me a bad person. I believe that minorities can succeed in a meritocracy. Oh my gosh.
Jared Kushner did not get into Harvard on merit. You're talking about kids who are going to school with their parents' name on the building. So if you're gonna so if you agree with me, stop going to the merit argument, because 70% of legacy of white students at Harvard are legacy admissions. They may not be qualified.
Scrapping diversity and inclusion programs. More problems or less problems?
Eliminating these programs certainly risks exacerbating one of the main problems in the U.S., which is, as I say, the large income and wealth gap that causes minorities to be restless. And so, look, I don't think these programs were meant to be forever solutions. They're rather a pathway to a better future where there is true equal opportunity, which would require maybe a different kind of affirmative action, like a massive Marshall Plan for improving education in disadvantaged neighborhoods.
Let's circle back to the issue of the Supreme Court itself. Is it becoming too political? Can it ever become apolitical, or return to be, or become, you be the judge of that, apolitical, Joe Bob?
I don't really see much in the way of problems with the Supreme Court. Just because it leans right for the first time in a ton of decades doesn't mean that it's a far extreme court. Just a quick statistic to throw out there that I think a lot of people don't know. Only 5% of cases in the Supreme Court in this cycle were a 6-3 decision. In other words, on ideological lines. So the overwhelming majority of the Supreme Court decisions are pretty in agreement with everybody. So the whole idea that the Supreme Court is just off the rails is kind of comical, especially when you look at the entirety of the scope of what they've looked at this term.
Joe, Bob, it would be equally comical not to understand that the majority of cases before the Supreme Court are not by their nature political. So what we should look at is what happens when clearly political cases end up before the Supreme Court. I doubt it's 5% of the cases, probably more like 95% of the cases. And look, to your question, Ellie, it's inevitable when the system of choosing Supreme Court justices is so politicized that they're chosen purely on a basis of their politics, and they're only human beings. They know they have to satisfy the people who appointed them. Indeed, they want to. That's why they're so political to begin with. The system is genuinely broken. If what you want is a Supreme Court that is a bunch of sages, sitting around thinking sagacious thoughts, what we have is a bunch of politicians, and it goes way back to the 5-4 vote that selected George Bush in 2000 when he failed to be elected.
And I would add to
Dr.
The
election discrepancies in that situation have been proven over and over and over.
Gentlemen, we want to hear all of you. It's difficult at the same time. Dr. DeBenga, please.
So the Supreme Court historically has only overturned about 1% of its decisions that it has made itself. 2 of those happened within the last week. This is a very activist-minded court, and if you're not going to start introducing things like term limits and the like, so people, judges don't hold on until their party person gets into power to elect another Republican or Democrat, it's always going to be politicized.
You see the result in the plummeting popularity of the court, and the politicized nature of those who like them versus dislike them.
In the court is because they're doing things that the media doesn't like, and therefore the media is hitting for it. As far as the quote-unquote
the media conspiracy
stuff, nobody's quite sure if they have to report any of the stuff that they're being accused of. And also, you have to say that hasn't influenced their choices in any way, shape, or form. Clarence Thomas
I've been in the media all my life, and only now do I realize I haven't been using all this power. I'd like to address one thing. Ellie, you asked how affirmative action has failed. Here's how I think it's failed. And this runs against the grain of Joe Bob's notion of liberal media conspiring to affect public opinion. We have been allowed to believe that affirmative action places into colleges people who are otherwise disqualified or unqualified, as opposed to the reality, which is that it allows race to be one of many factors. Just as the famous 2019 study at Harvard showed that legacy and other legacy-related issues, which obviously favors white Americans, is a factor. No one actually thinks that a legacy is the only reason unqualified candidates got in, but it's allowed to be a factor. Now, who knows? If race is not allowed to be a factor, because in the real world there is a problem with race relations and the balance of power and of wealth between the races in America, then perhaps we should ban legacy admissions as well. Maybe we will.
Joe Bob.
I said from the onset, yeah, legacy admissions are ridiculous to me as well. But that doesn't mean that justifies letting people into schools based entirely on their race.
Not entirely. Don't repeat it. Joe Bob, it's not entirely.
It's not.
It's a factor. This is genuinely a complex issue that I think we should be able to address without partisan bickering.
On that note, I will thank you very much for your time. 2 minutes, and we're back.